Hello and welcome back to our Java beginner tutorial videos. This is what, number 6, I think. 6, 5? I think it's 6. And our topic today is strings. And you might be thinking to yourself, I already know everything about strings. I know how to create them. I know how to print them. What else is there left to know? Well, unfortunately, it turns out there's quite a bit left to know about strings. And that's what today is dedicated to, is to explaining not all of the details, but many of the details. The first thing to keep in mind is what I said at the very beginning when we talked about data types in lesson 2, which is that strings are a complex data type. And the terminology in Java is actually that a string represents a class. And another example of a class that we use is console. Console that we use for input and output in my courses is an example of a class. And classes are complex, and classes have a number of methods, which are things that you can do with that class. Primitive data types, on the other hand, they don't. They have some very primitive operations like plus and minus and divide that you've learned about, but they don't have more complex methods that you can do, like comparing the lengths or grabbing a character adder, right? All of those things are things that strings can do because they're a complex type, because they are a class. And today what we're going to do is go over some of those things that you can do with strings. And so the first thing to remember is how to create a string. So the way that you create a string is you can say string name equals, and you can give it some sort of a string value, and you end that with a semicolon. So that's how I would create a string. The other thing that we've talked about is how to do stuff with a complex variable like a string. And so remember, the way that we do that is we use the name and we use a period, which a period is saying, let me access all of the methods, all of the things that I can do with a string. And not just with any string, but with this particular string that has a name and that has a value called Sparky the dog. The proper terminology for this is that name is an instance or an example or an implementation of a string. Really, the only proper term there is instance. It's an instance of. I can have many instances of a string, but they're all still going to follow the same blueprint or the same class, which is what we call this string. And so what I can do here after that period is whatever methods or whatever functions have been defined for a string. What can I do with a string? And you'll notice that most IDEs, like NetBeans, which is the one that we use, will give you a drop-down list of all of those things. And so all I'm doing today is really going through a few of those items from that drop-down list. One of them, which would be, length. So this would accomplish something. And that's what we're going to cover today. So now that we have that out of the way, the other thing I want you to know is how this string is represented inside the computer. So it's represented, a bunch of memory is reserved for this particular string, and it's represented as a list of characters. So here we can see Sparky the dog, and you can see the way that every single character is its own particular item. So S is an item, P is an item, A is an item, and they're all connected in this list. You're going to learn about the proper term for that later on and how to actually create your own lists, and that term is called an array. But right now we can just think of this as a list that has a starting value and an ending value. And you'll notice that this list can be numbered, and it's really important that you get used to this idea of numbering in programming, which usually starts with 0. Numbering usually starts with 0, so that means that S is at position 0. T over here is at position 7, and G is at position 13. So you need to get used to this idea of numbering. So what sorts of things might you want to do here? Well, one of the first things that you might want to do is grab a particular character from a string. I have this string, which is a whole bunch of characters. What if I want to know what the very first character is? An example program would be if you want to sort people by their last name. So they type in their last name, and now you want to grab just the first character of that last name. And so the way that we do it is by accessing a method called character@. And when you access this method, you have to give it a number. And that number is representing the position inside the string where you want to get that character. So let's have a look at Sparky here. And let's say I want to do name.character@3. What this is going to do is this is going to give back to me the character at position 3, not the A. That is the third character, but that's not the position. The position is going to be here, so this is going to return an R to me. And if I want to store that value, so this whole thing here is going to give me back an R. If I want to store it, I have to give it a spot where I want to keep it. So I don't know, we'll just call it like this, throw in our semicolon, and now once I run this line of code, temp is going to be given the value of R or capital S or E. Okay? So that's the idea of grabbing individual characters. If you try to grab a character that goes too far, like 14 or -1, when you try to run the code, you'll get an error back. Out of bounds, it will say. So that means that you've gone outside of the bounds of the string. Bad programmer, fix your error, try again. Okay, so that's the other thing to keep in mind, is that it is possible to go out of bounds, and then you're going to get an out of bounds error. And that means that you made a mistake somewhere in your code. Notice that this won't be a syntax error. It's not going to stop your program from actually compiling and trying to run. It's while it's running that something is going to break when you do that. Another useful thing is to figure out the length of a string, because when you're getting input from the keyboard, you don't necessarily know how long the person is going to type something in. So you might want to get the length of it. And length, you'll notice, doesn't take any input. All that it does is it calculates the length and gives you back a number that you can then manipulate. This gets a little bit tricky for beginner programmers, because if you look at Sparky the dog up there, take a moment, pause the video if you need to, and tell me how long Sparky the dog is. All right, you have that number in your head? If you said 13, you're wrong. And the reason that you're wrong if you said 13 is because you have to remember that we're always counting at 0. So the length is always going to be one more than the last character, right? 1 to 13 plus you need to add in the 0. So here, as another example, I could say int length equals name.length, and what this would do is this would fill it with 14, because 14 is going to be the length of this. Later on in the course, when we get to loops, you're going to be able to use this length to say, okay, I want to loop through every single character here, starting at 0 and going to 13. The equals method is a way of telling you whether one string equals another string. So what would be a great example of this? Let's say you were writing a program where someone had to enter in their password. And the password is going to be Bob. So name is going to, well, let's just make the password Sparky the dog. And so you want to know whether what's been typed in matches that super secret password. And that's where this comes in, where I pass in I have to give it information, which is the thing that I'm comparing it to. And so this would look something like this. So equals is going to give you a true or false to tell you whether it's equal or not. So let's just say and I would say name dot equals, and I would write inside here the thing that I'm trying to compare it to. So let's say the password is supposed to be secret. So now what it's going to do is it's going to compare the contents of name, which is Sparky the dog, with whatever's in here, which is secret. It's going to say these things are not equal, and then it is going to return a false. So answer will be false. What I put inside here has to be a string, but it could be another variable. If I had another variable string, I could put that inside there in order to do that comparison. Keep in mind that it is comparing in detail. So it's comparing the case, it's comparing spaces, and it is going letter by letter. And as soon as it finds a difference, it's going to say, nope, that's not equal, done. So what if you don't care about the case? Well, if you don't care about the case, there's some helpful methods here that will allow you to convert everything to uppercase or everything to lowercase. The important part here, and I'm going to throw another strange word at you, is a term called immutable. And strings are immutable. And what that means is that you can't change a string. I cannot take this particular string and turn it into uppercase. What I could do is I can create a new string that has the same letters, except they're all turned into uppercase. But I cannot turn this into uppercase. I cannot take a particular letter and change it, because strings, once they're created, can't be changed. They're immutable. That's that term. So how would I change this to be uppercase? Well, I can use these methods. And what often happens is beginner programmers will do this. And Java will not give you any sort of, won't tell you it's upset. It'll go ahead and run it. But remember I said name cannot be changed. This is not changing name to be uppercase. What it's doing is it's creating a new string, and you have to do something with that string. Just like here, it gave you the length, but you had to store it somewhere. It grabbed the character, but you had to store it somewhere. This is going to create a brand new string where everything is uppercase. And so I can store that into a new variable. But if I really just wanted to turn this into uppercase, what I would do is I would say name equals. And so what that's going to do is this is going to create a brand new string where it's uppercase, and then it's going to replace the variable so that the variable now points to this new string that I've created. So it kind of does the same thing that you want to do, which is make it uppercase, but it's important you understand it is not actually changing it. It's creating a new string and then making sure that name points to this new string instead. Good so far? All right. There are two other things that I wanted to talk to you about, and they are by far the more complicated things. So if you want to take a break and practice yourself some of the things that we've talked about so far, please go ahead and do so. When you're ready, you can continue playing this video. So the last two things are really neat and powerful tools, but they are a little bit more complicated. One of them is substring. So very often you will want to grab a part of this string. Maybe I wanted to grab just the middle the. And so way to do that is by using substring. And what makes substring hard to use is that, first of all, it takes two pieces of information, two integers, numbers, one that represents the starting position of where you want to start grabbing text, and the other one represents the ending position. And it's going to grab everything between the start and the end. But you're going to notice that when I wrote this, I kind of put an I here. That's an I, and that's an E. And so the thing that you have to remember is that the start is inclusive. In other words, if I put a 1 in here, it will include the thing in position 1. But the end is exclusive. And that means that it will not include that ending position or that ending character. And that can get really confusing, not just for beginner programs. Sometimes I forget, because also different languages will grab substrings in different ways. And so I will often make mistakes when doing this. So remember that substring, I mean, you can't change the string, so substring is going to give you back a new string that represents just the part that you want to look at. So let's just give us an example here. So string new string equals name.substring. And so let's say I want to grab the, so I want to start at 7. And I want to end at 9, but remember it's exclusive. So what I need to do is put in 10 over there. And so what this will do is it will grab THE, 7, 8, 9. What if I wanted to grab dog? Take a second, pause, think about it for yourself for a moment. So what I would do here is I would start at 11 and I'd want to end at 14. Now, how do you know where 14 is? Like, it seems kind of odd to do. What I recommend when you want to grab something that goes till the end is to always use something that you just learned, which is name.length. And so now what I have is I have something that will go to 14, but if this were longer, if there were more things after this, it would go always to the end of the string. So it's going to start at 11 with D, and it's going to go right till the very end of the string and grab everything. So that's how you can use methods in a powerful way to accomplish things. What would you do if you wanted to grab just one character? Well, I'm going to leave that for you to kind of think about, but just remember that inclusive and exclusive piece. And that should sort of help you figure out how to grab just one character from it. Again, you will get some errors if you try to go outside the bounds of the string. If I were to try to go to 15 or 16 or 18, you will get that same error telling you, you made a mistake, you got to fix it. Okay, so that leaves us with one last thing. So remember that characters in Java are represented just by numbers. And what that means is that you can do some really neat comparisons. So if you wanted to take somebody's name and everyone last name and everyone between A and L had to go into a particular group or something like that, you could use equals for it. You could also start to use more complex comparisons. You could grab a character, you could use greater than, you could use less than, but there are also ways to compare two strings together and to say whether a string is greater than another string or less than another string or equal to another string. And it's important to know how that comparison works. And what the comparison will do is it will compare the first letters of both strings, and if they're equal, it will then jump to the second, and then it will jump to the third, and it will keep going until it finds some character that is different. And so let's say I had, let's give us an example over here. Name.compare to, and we're going to give this Sparks. So what this will do is it will compare the S's and say, nope, they're the same, we're all good, and then it'll do the P, and then it'll do the A, and then it'll do the R, then it'll do the K. When it gets to the Z, it's going to see a difference. And because Z is represented by a bigger number, then that means that Sparks is going to be considered bigger than Sparky the dog. Doesn't matter that Sparky the dog is longer, this one is going to be the bigger number. It's going to be greater than. This is greater than that. It's a really tricky concept for someone new to programming to kind of figure out. But just remember that letters are represented contiguously with numbers, and that you can compare them letter by letter. And that's what's happening in this particular case. You're comparing your string with some other string. And this method is going to give you back a number representing whether it's going to be greater than or less than or equal to. And I've kind of given the hints or the tips over here. And so if I did something like this, name, which is our x over here, is going to be less than sparks. So you are going to get back a negative number. That doesn't mean much to you yet, because what are you going to do with that negative number? And that's where decisions come in. And that's why we haven't taught this until after decisions, is because now that you have this, you can make some decisions about it. You can say, well, if it's less than, I want to do this. And if it's equal to, I want to do this. And if it's greater than, I want, right? So you can start to make those decisions. If this was Sparka, then I would have Sparky the dog being greater than, and I would end up with a positive number. So answer would be greater than 0. And if I had this to be identical, which I'm not going to type out, but if this said Sparky the dog, then they would be equal, and this output would be 0. And that's the key here. Answer is either going to be a negative number if it's smaller, 0 if it's equal, or a positive number if it's greater. And by knowing that, you're going to be able to throw this into an if statement, where you're going to be able to do something like, if answer is greater than 0, then do something. Else if answer is equal to 0, do something else. Oops. And so on and so forth. And so this will allow you to do some really nuanced comparisons. So there's a few other things in the lessons that we go over, but as far as the video series, this gives you what you need to know, the essentials of how to manipulate a string. I strongly encourage you to go ahead and look at the string API. Remember that everything in Java has documentation with it. Go ahead and look at all the methods that are available, because I've only touched on a few of them. There's a lot more subtlety and a lot more power. There's other types of substrings, for example, or other ways of manipulating characters. This is just an introduction of the most commonly used methods associated with strings. And you as a programmer, you will have to use these at some point, often very frequently. So take a moment, review the lesson, take some notes, make sure you feel confident with strings, practice a little bit in your development environment of manipulating a few strings so that you can feel confident with this subject. Hope this video helps, and I'll see you next time.